had begun in the coal bins of the ship. But regardless of that, the Yellow Press, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer in their newspapers were pushing for war, and the Americans were too. And so despite McKinley's best intentions, he ends up asking Congress for a declaration of war, which they profess in April of 1898. And we are actually in the war for about 3.5 months. It's pretty short. It included our attack on the Philippines, as well as Puerto Rico and Cuba. And at the end of the war, we, through the Treaty of Paris of 1898, and again, ended up getting Puerto Rico and Cuba and Guam as American protectorates, and we purchased the Philippines for $20 million because the Philippines were not taken by the U.S. forces until after the armistice had already been signed. So Spain expected us to pay for the land, and they weren't just going to cede it to us. So we talked about that. We talked about the fact that Cuba got their independence because of an amendment that we had attached to our Declaration of War called the Platt Amendment, which gave them their independence in 1902. And then we also talked about the fact that we didn't give the Philippines their independence, and because they didn't get independence, they rebelled.
Did we make them fight for it?
They chose to fight for it, and they didn't win. We put down the rebellion. It lasted about 2 years, and it cost us more men and more money to put down the Filipino insurrection than it did to actually fight the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. And we end up keeping the Philippines as a protectorate. We talked about William Howard Taft becoming the governor of the Philippines. He called them their little brown brothers, his little brown brothers. And that eventually they would get their independence, but not until after World War II. It would be July 4th, 1946 that they actually get their independence. And then we started talking a little bit about things that were going on in other areas of the world under Teddy Roosevelt, because once McKinley gets assassinated, Roosevelt takes over as president, and Teddy Roosevelt goes into areas like the Dominican Republic and Venezuela, and he deals with issues of paying back debt because they owed debt to European nations, and Roosevelt did not want the European nations to get involved in this hemisphere. So he sends the U.S. troops over there basically to run their ports, to make sure that all of the incoming goods are being taxed accordingly, and they use the tariffs to pay off their debts. And that's how we keep the Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. And so because of this, he adds an addition to the Monroe Doctrine called the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine basically says that the United States will become the international police officer, in particular in the Western Hemisphere. That not only are the European countries not allowed to interfere, but if we find that the other countries in the Western Hemisphere, you okay?
I'm sick.
Okay, if you need some, sickish. If we find that the other countries in the Western Hemisphere are not stable, we will intervene to help them become stable. So it allows American intervention while keeping out the Europeans. So it's an addition to the Monroe Doctrine.
Why was the Monroe Doctrine made?
The Monroe Doctrine back in 1820, when it was first signed and put out there,